Okay, good morning. Welcome to the special council meeting of August 24th, 2020. I'll call the meeting to order and would just like to note that for number 4 new business, we'll address the landing issue first and the zoning bylaw issue second. That will allow staff and others to go on with their days. We'll ask the clerk to do a roll call, please.
Councillor Shortreed.
You're on mute, Councillor Shortreed.
Sorry, present.
Councillor Dayu.
Here.
Councillor Barry.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Danielson.
Here.
Mayor Moffat.
I am present as well, thank you. Are there any declarations of pecuniary interest today? Seeing none, we are going to move straight into closed session. So I would ask for a mover and a seconder to do that, please. Councillor Shortreed and Councillor Barry.
Moved by Councillor Shortreed, seconded by Councillor Barry. Be it resolved that council adjourns its special meeting at 9:01 a.m. to proceed into closed session in accordance with section 239(2)(f) for the purpose of discussing advice that is subject to solicitor-client privilege, including communications necessary for that purpose.
You've heard that resolution. All in favor? And that's carried. Okay, welcome back to the open session of the August 24th, 2020 council meeting. May I have a mover and a seconder to resume the open portion of the meeting? Kind of closed. Councillor Dayu and Councillor Barry.
Moved by Councillor Dayu, seconded by Councillor Barry. Be it resolved that council adjourns its closed session at 10:51 a.m. and reconvenes a special meeting of council.
All in favor? That's carried, thank you. As noted at the beginning of the meeting, I did switch up the 2 items of new business. So we're going to talk about the Hardwood Landing project, and we're going to bring in Chris Card, the Parks, Rec and Trails Manager, as this is his report, so that you can speak to it. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning.
So first up for you, or only up for you today, is it's a somewhat lengthy report. We've all read it in detail, but if you'd like to just start at the top and give us the overview, and then we'll dive into some questions.
Sure. So as council's aware, in the middle of July, the Hardwood Landing Rehabilitation Project started. The contract was awarded to Fowler's Construction, who is working on site. As there's 2 pier walls that are being replaced, and at the finish of one, the ward councillor and other councillors and myself and the mayor were receiving some resident correspondence with some concerns over some of the new design parameters, specifically related to height of the new wall. Subsequent to that, I had a site meeting with the mayor, and following that, each member of council, at which point we did put a stop work order on the project at the completion, well, the partial completion of the first wall, so that we could review the resident concerns relative to the design parameters, and potentially look at solutions moving forward. So the main concerns, and I've listed them within this report, is a number of things just around the height of the wall and the water levels. Understanding that people use these walls as a mooring point, a location to get in and out of their boats after they've taken them from adjacent shoreline storage, a place to load groceries, materials for their cottages, and also for construction barges for any sorts of construction projects happening at any of the lakes. So what you'll see in the report is information relative to the design parameters, which gives measurements of the structure in relation to water lines, and what that relates to on the existing structure. I've put in some on page 2, some images which just outlines some visuals to help understand the differences between the two, as well as measurements of water levels. The township is under contract for this, and any considerations for change work orders would be associated with that. Something that I've also highlighted in this is the bylaw considerations relative to our mooring and docking bylaw, which speaks specifically to regulations around timelines for mooring on municipal shoreline structures, as well as parking, unloading, and having boats stored on beach areas adjacent to municipal boat launches. I've attached that portion of the bylaw to the agenda as well. So subsequent to the stop work order, had some discussions with Tulloch, who's the engineer on the project, and gave them information on the concerns that we were getting from residents, and looking at potential alternatives or solutions. Those are listed starting on page 4, and that's what you see all in the italics portion, along with some estimated costing. Now, the costs in these estimates are estimates, so any option that we wanted to go ahead with, we would first have to go and get those costs refined through the processes associated with a change work order. I did refine some of the costing myself based on the recommendation of Tulloch, which is to move ahead with the project as planned, and add some floating docks in order to facilitate the mooring that's required at that location. And I offer that costing in my recommendation, which is lower than their estimated costing. So what we're looking at today with this discussion is to hope to look at the options and the desired solutions for moving ahead, and whether or not that be a change to the process and the parameters, and potentially redesign, or going with something similar to what we have in other nearby locations, which is to facilitate mooring through a docking structure, while also adding some bumpers on the new walls to be able to facilitate mooring during times of high water or favorable water levels. And this is in line with what TULIC's recommendations are. At the same time, looking for council's input and feedback around the docking and mooring bylaw in relation to this location, and the recommendations include some signage and indication around that bylaw. So looking for questions, feedbacks, thoughts from council.
Thank you for that, Chris. I'm wondering, I suspect that there are a lot of questions and comments, and instead of trying to decide how to sort of organize it the way it should fall out, I will just open it up to council, and if we can maybe start at anything that's just sort of go through the report in report order, if at all possible, but I would just open it up for questions from council on the topic, or what your preferred options are, or I'm just basically opening it up to council for thoughts. So, Councillor Dayu.
You're on mute.
You're on mute.
Thank you very much.
Jordan.
Thank you, Mayor Moffat. I have, as you know, spent a considerable amount of time liaising with the cottagers and residents of Hardwood. They have offered some excellent feedback with regards to the real life situation on the lake, what the structures are typically used for, and indeed how some of the recommended possibilities for council's consideration may or may not work vis-a-vis the real life uses of those structures. So as per your suggestion, if we went through the list according to Mr. Card's report, I could certainly offer some real life feedback on the practicality of these options. So if you would like me to do that all in one fell swoop, I'd be happy to, or Madam Mayor, if you prefer to take it one option at a time, I'd be happy to chip in there too, but it would be great to offer that feedback as appropriate.
Okay, I think what we should do in terms of the feedback is that you could provide it as we move through the options, so that we don't forget what you said about option 1 when we're looking at option 5. That might be easier. In terms of, are there any other questions, clarifications that are required from Mr. Card about his report and any of the information in it that anybody from on council wants to ask? Deputy Mayor Danielson.
Just a comment. I think that that we can probably, well, of course, we can go through the options that have been provided to us. I'm just acknowledging that we will need to get costs, more detailed costs, because that is going to factor into, certainly would factor into my final decision. How much it's going to cost is a factor. I think we've all spent a considerable amount of time on this, given the concerns that have been raised. So I just want us to reach the best conclusion for all concerned.
Indeed, and I think the good thing about the process is that we heard concerns, we listened to them, we heard them, we have heard them, we have investigated thoroughly, and we have asked for and or have reviewed some options. So I think that's on the upside of the whole situation. I guess I'll just then, if there's no further questions or clarifications, then we'll just start with the options. I think one of the things that's important too is that actually I have a question for Chris, that the floating docks that are being suggested, these are not little wobbly finger docks. These are commercial grade docks, similar to what's there and what is similar to what's at our other landings in the township. Is that correct?
That is correct. They are commercial grade docks, and they would be identical to the ones we installed in 2017 at nearby Russell Landing on Quagama Lake.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Barry? You're on mute.
What is the lifespan of one of those docks?
They're warranted. The floats are warranted on them for 25 years. And the structures, typically wooden structures, you're into starting having to replace members at the 10 to 12 year point, and then potential full replacement at the 15 to 20 year point. And that's depending on a number of factors, but that's a typical anticipated lifespan.
Thank you.
Any other questions before we dive into the options? Councillor Dayu.
Chris, a question to the degree that you're able to answer it. Do we know how flexible our conversation can be on the second pier? So we've got question number one, which is what to do with the first pier, which has been constructed, and we have a series of good options to consider. But then is the second pier entirely open for discussion at this stage, or is that something that we would need to go back to, to the engineers on, or where do we stand with that second pier?
Go ahead, Chris.
Both. So essentially, the second pier is certainly completely up for discussion. The project is on a complete hold until we come to a consensus on a solution there. If we were to go outside of the existing design parameters, it would be something that would have to be redesigned and then costed.
And I think it's important to point out in the greater picture that that we are looking for a resolution to the challenges that are in the best interest of all the taxpayers whose dollars contribute to the central pot, and that has to be, whatever decision we come to, if we come to one today, needs to be considered in the context of all the municipalities' projects and needs and budgetary considerations, including restraints. And I would also just remind council that that historically in the last few years, council has removed docks from other water access points that serve far more users, and that the township, with regard to budgets and timelines, and also we're waiting for our asset management plan, which is unfortunately very delayed, that we've already deferred parking lots for other water access users in other areas. So one of the things we've always tried to do is make sure we have an equitable application of processes and sort of an equitable distribution of funds and resources as best we can. So I think it's important that we keep that in mind as well. If it comes down to a choice of how much money to spend, I think that we need to find something that is the best and most cost-effective solution given the amount of the project already. And I think some of those options are worth looking at. There's no question that no matter what decision we make, unless it's option one, that there's going to be money involved, and so we need to have regard for that. So I think if we go to the options, I guess the first one is do nothing. We know that there's an amount, $5,000 for a standby charge that's currently in place. And I guess I'll just say, open up to council. What are council's thoughts on option number one, which is do nothing and proceed with the original design? Yes, no, maybe. Deputy Mayor Danielson.
I don't think we can consider option number one. I think that there are some things that we're going to have to do depending on cost, and option number one, do nothing, is out for me. At the very least, we're going to have to add an extended dock to the first pier that's been constructed. So that's over and above do nothing. So option one's out as far as I'm concerned.
And without asking each person to weigh in to speak, unless you absolutely feel that you would like to, Does council generally supportive of option 1 is not an option?
Yes.
We'll go line through that. Option 2 is to lower the walls. Now, Chris, can you advise, is this lower the walls of the existing one or build the second one lower? Can you clarify that?
It would be for both. And again, if that's the desired direction, an exact final cost would have to be ascertained. But it would be to both.
Okay, and my question is, the final point that has been provided from the engineer is the potential for future flooding and loss of material. And I wonder if we need to seek further clarification on what that could mean for us or for users or just for, construction wisdom. Deputy Mayor Danielson.
I would like to break option 2 into 2 parts. Personally, I'm not prepared for us to alter the first pier that's been constructed. Although I would like to see what the cost would be. To me, that's just too cost prohibitive. I think as long as we're prepared to put a dock at the end of the pier and add additional bumpers to that first pier, that we're probably covering the greatest concerns there. As far as the second pier, and I still have questions about the stability and how we could put in 2 rows of blocks rather than 3. I'm not in favor of having to dig down into the substrate and possibly get into drilling and blasting. That's too expensive an option as well. I would like to hear what the engineer's justification for us being able to lower the height based on the standards that the first pier was built at. Like we need to know the difference there. I would, if we could lower the second pier by 1 row of blocks without an awful lot of additional costs, I would be open to that.
Okay, other thoughts on option 2? Councillor Barry.
Has there been any discussion of lowering the first dock and not constructing the second dock? Not the second pier?
I don't know if Chris has had any such discussions with the engineers on that. Chris, did you want to speak to that?
No, that hasn't been discussed.
Take away the mooring space.
I would have to say that I do agree with Deputy Mayor Danielson that I can't see dismantling the first pier. I think that's not a viable solution. And given the amount of money this project costs, to me, I'm looking to find the best fix that addresses the majority of the needs of the users in terms of accessibility and safety. I'm fine with all of that, but I really do struggle with trying to make a decision that turns into a custom-made design solution for the user group when that's not how we do things generally. So I'm going to go to Councillor Gaillou and then back to Councillor Barry.
I respectfully disagree with the mayor and deputy mayor. I think it is an option that we should very strongly consider. Certainly, as Deputy Mayor Danielson has already said, we can certainly get the costs. There's no harm in at least understanding what the real price tag would be, bearing in mind that there could be a bit of a balance on the statement. If, for example, we are able to surplus some of the additional materials, sell them back, have them restocked. If it's decided that we will not proceed with the second pier using the ready rock material, for example, it could be that those pieces that have already been purchased could be surplused. I don't have the answer to that, but I think when we look at what the real cost is of lowering the dock, that those would be fair questions to ask. It could bring the tally down to a manageable level, and certainly lowering the first pier by removing the middle level from a practical perspective is very much the first, I'm going to say the first choice of the Hardwood Lake cottagers. I realize they do not have a vote here, and I don't mean it from that perspective. What I'm referring to is their practical life on the lake and how they use those structures would certainly be best served by replacing what was there, either with the new material or with the old material, but basically sticking to the design that has been in place for years and years and which works very, very well. As you'll hear when we get into options 3 and 4, etc., some of the workarounds are, they're good ideas, but there are sticking points in terms of the practical life with those workarounds. The adaptations would not be as good as what simply lowering the pier could offer. So if we could come up with a sturdy assessment of costs, which might include surplusing those additional materials, I'd really like us to continue to consider the lowering of the first pier via the removal of the middle layer.
Thank you for that. I think part of the, before I go to Councillor Berry, part of the discussion, which is a difficult one, is around exactly what you mentioned, Councillor Dayu, that the traditional use of that landing has been thus for years. Though the landings have been used as docks, they are not docks, although they have been used in that way. And council decided for purposes of longevity and maintenance to go with the rock. I think the issue in question is the height. So I'm wondering, like how unreasonable would it be to implement, for example, the floating dock option, which is, I mean, I'll just tell you right now, that's my preferred option, and then asking people to adapt their use. We have faced a similar situation at Little Hawk, where we had a similar situation. It's a big crib, a very tall crib landing with a gangplank that goes up and down to a floating dock. And there are people there who have, over time, they can still get sort of barges in because through the boat launch is right there. But there are other people in other lakes who have had to adapt their the way they use the infrastructure, and there are other people that are moving materials and fridges and stoves on dollies down a gangplank to a dock into a boat. So, you know, there is the question about the existing use, and is the existing use the appropriate use? Perhaps we didn't know that folks were using that pier for those purposes, and we do have to have a bigger conversation about docks and landings and our overall philosophy, and maybe that the use of the mooring bylaw and those things could factor into that. I do struggle with spending money to provide an opportunity for people to contravene our own bylaw. And I can't quite reconcile that. So I think that needs to be part of the conversation as well. Councillor Berry.
I'm just in looking at the photos that Tulloch has provided. In photograph number 2, that is sort of where I sit with this project. I feel that the pier has been built with longevity in mind, and now it is seen that we're going to have to probably spend money on more docking. I'm wondering, can we consider purchasing more docking, keep the existing project as it's been built, and improve their launch or their driving in access? I keep thinking of all of the boat launches across the entire municipality, and I think photograph 2 that they have submitted should be able to be a consideration in this project. I really question a second landing.
And I wonder, that may be a question, if council's interested in pursuing it, maybe a question of the engineers, or it could be a contractual issue. there's scope of work issues that need to be addressed. So, is it for you?
Sorry.
Put yourself on mute.
Oh, now we're gonna know who they're calling from. Good, thank you. That may be something that Chris could take back and as part of the inquiry to say, what does that look like? But because we don't know. I mean, what I'm looking for is what council wants, what further information council wants to have. Deputy Mayor Danielson?
I know that this flies against our bylaw, but one of the things that was addressed was the number of boats that could moor at any given time. I would just be concerned that if we didn't do something in the location of the second pier, that we're seriously reducing the amount of space for boats to moor, even on a short-term basis, you know, even if they're within the 12 hours. That they've got space to moor X number of boats. And if we don't do a second pier, that takes that away, whether it be higher or lower, or no matter what it's built out of.
And I think part of that, sorry, go ahead, please.
No, I've got a comment, but it's not related to that.
Okay, and I was wondering too, it's a small number of folks who need boat access. You know, how it's a numbers game. How many people would ever be going into town to get groceries at the same time, and we don't know that. So we are not, as has been stated in some of the documentation, the municipality is not a marina, and you know, how do we split the difference between providing options for access that are safe versus, you know, putting out infrastructure that suits every single user's needs in every circumstance. We don't do that anywhere else, and I just want to be careful that we don't. The conversation doesn't turn into a custom dock building conversation or a custom landing building conversation. Councillor Dayu.
I would agree with you in principle, Madam Mayor. I think in this instance, we've got to also bear in mind that what they used to have actually worked fairly well. What the municipality has put in place is not effective. It could be argued it is not fit for purpose. I, as a 46-year-old, would struggle greatly to get on and off of that dock. So while I understand your point philosophically and would agree with it, I do think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that if we're going to take away a service, that we replace it. If we take away a service with the intention of replacing it, that we do replace it with something that is as useful as the one that we've taken away.
Okay, good point. Thank you. So we are still on option 2. We've landed on a number of inquiries about costs and viability of option 2, whether it's for one or both, and I think that would include seeking clarification on the final comment, the final note in the report that suggests there's a potential for flooding, and that none of us being engineers, that we would need to ask about that, ask for clarification on that. Is what I'm hearing. I see Councillor Dayu, Councillor Shortreed, and then Deputy Mayor Danielson. Please go ahead.
On option number 2, my main question to the engineers would be, given the height of the pier currently, especially when considering low water levels, how long a ramp would they have to install in order to make sure that the slope wasn't very steep? And I ask because given that about half of the cottagers on the lake are water access only, it means that anything that they might want to do, change windows, put in a new kitchen, whatever it is, has to happen via that landing. And as one constituent said, and I thought it was an extremely good point, he said, you know, imagine if you needed to put a new wood stove in to your cottage. Before, what you would do is back your truck down as close to the water's edge as you can, open up the hood, get 6 of your best friends to help you lug the thing, laterally from your truck to the landing, and from the landing onto the pontoon. And that worked well because there was minimal distance involved. If now we are proceeding to put down a floating dock with a ramp, given how high that pier is for those low water times, what distance would have to be traveled with a wood stove before you were able to laterally put it onto the onto the pontoon boat? And that goes for construction materials. It goes for any number of things that are weighty and cumbersome. So that would be my principal question for the engineer: are those dimensions?
And so I'm making a note of the things that you guys are asking, and I believe the CAO is as well. So we can certainly find that out as well as part of this conversation. Is there anything else for option 2 that is of interest, or that there's any inquiries about from members of council? Oh, Councillor Shortreed, yes, go ahead.
In option 2, it says to remove 1 full course of ready rock, it'll bring it to 0 approximately to the high water level. Is there an option for a different size of ready rock, or is it only come in one size?
Perhaps Mr. Card knows that.
I asked that question, and it is anything outside of what's been specified would be a custom order, and whether or not that custom order would be possible would also have to be ascertained. But for this application, those block heights are set.
Thanks.
I think Councillor Berry was next. Oh no, it's Deputy Mayor Danielson. Go ahead, Liz.
So we're looking at 2 different things for the possibility of lowering the docks. And one, being excavating and lowering 3 rows of blocks, and another being installing 2 rows of blocks instead of 3. So we still need to clarify whether that's going to affect the integrity of the structure by having just the 2 rows of blocks, and what the cost would be for each option. And then we're still faced with how, if we only put in 2 rows of blocks, how the water action would impact over time, the surface of the structure. I'm glad that Councillor Dayu raised the point about the dimensions or the length of the ramp between the pier and the dock. That was a question that I had quite early on, and I know that I think the response was that there can be some adjustments made to it, but I still think that if it's short, if it's say for the same length as the one that's existing on the old remaining pier, that there would be some problems with the angle. So we might have to,
and again, we don't know that, right? That's what we need to find out.
so that's one of our takeaways.
Yeah, and I think we need to remember it's a small lake that doesn't have tremendous fluctuations, as I keep referring to the Hawks, where certainly at Little Hawk they can lose 4 and 5 feet of water, and they have a crib structure, a movable gangway, and substantial commercial grade floating docks, and they manage just fine. So just offer that. Deputy Mayor Danielson, go ahead, please.
Just one more point. If we could all look at image number 1 in, I think it's Chris's report, page 2 of 7. Image number 1 shows the new pier behind the existing old pier. And if you look at it at the point closest to the land, there's not a lot of difference in height. I know there isn't history on the actual height of the original structure, but I think you can see that, although it's pretty shocking to look at the new pier and see, oh my gosh, it looks so high, that I'm not sure that there was a huge difference from when it was originally built.
Well, and you could be right. We also, another thing we don't know, and I'm sure that the folks who have been using that landing for, 30, 40, some, I think, Councillor Dayu have been there for, a lot longer than that. They might disagree. And I think that's, again, where in our consideration, we need to balance, just what you've mentioned, that one of the reasons these piers are being replaced is because they have slumped and shrunk and are probably a quite different version of their original selves, but we don't have the advantage of knowing that because we're all just too darn young. Okay, is anybody else for questions on or questions for option 2? Councillor Dayu.
One final question for number 2 then. I read in Mr. Card's report that there is the potential for erosion of the material on top should the high water mark go above that top portion if we were to lower down the dock. So my corollary question for the engineers would be, given that scenario, what would they propose is done in order to avoid those eventualities from occurring? And what would that cost?
Sorry, what's the question? That if the wall is lowered, how are they going to prevent overtopping?
Not how they would prevent overtopping, but if I go to Chris's report, hold on a moment, to the options. Option number 2, lower walls. The final bullet point is potential for future flooding of walls and loss of materials from within the walls, if that option is considered. And I wonder if the engineers could propose what might be done in order to avoid that eventuality, if there is indeed something to think about.
I suspect they would suggest a third course of Ready Rock.
I wonder what else they have in mind.
And that's the question that I've mentioned. That's the note I've mentioned a couple of times because and I think that needs to be looked at further in terms of responsibility, liability, accountability, and whose role in all of that. So, okay, so the option 3 is adding additional ramps and docks to the end. There is a ramp and a dock already there, so it would be adding a second one to the other arm. And I did want to comment too that it does say in Chris's report that certainly his price on achieving that solution is substantially less than what the consultant has suggested. So I'd go with Chris's price on that. And I think I've made it very clear. I mean, our job is to have a fulsome conversation and land somewhere we can all live with. But there's my choice is that this option is my preferred choice. But we can still get answers for some of the other questions. So thoughts on thoughts on option 3. Deputy Mayor Danielson.
This was my first, in my mind, my first solution. I like it. I think that it will cause the least amount of disruption with respect to construction and costs and engineering time. I would like to get the information on about lowering the second pier, but if it's substantial, I like this option. I acknowledging that Jen speaks to purpose and what that purpose has been or how it's been used for a long time, and I know that would be a new way for people to learn to use the structure overall, and there's some difficulty with that, and I know that people won't be happy with that, but I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe that this option will allow people to achieve, for the most part, what they need to do. I'm still worried about managing construction material or heavy items, but I acknowledge that in other locations, people have somehow managed to do it.
Councillor Barry, is your hand up? You're on mute.
Sorry, just to be clear, for option 3, this additional ramp would be on the new pier?
Both piers.
Yeah, it would end up, would it not, Chris? This is to establish a ramp and floating dock at the end of each pier for ingress and egress. Is that correct?
Yes, so under the current project scope, there's already an existing 8 foot by 16 dock with a gangway that would go on one pier. So this is suggesting the solution of adding another dock to the other pier. And it goes in line with further and other considerations that I put below. What would then have to be decided is what size of docks, and then you're considering available mooring space based on size. So option 3 here would be to add that additional dock on one pier. And what I'm suggesting is you could add you could increase the size of the dock that exists on the existing one and then add a dock on the new one.
Okay, so I think Liz made a good point that this is the least disruptive. It's certainly the most cost effective, and also, as Liz noted, it could be the one that achieves the majority of the things that folks need to do. Again, with an adaptation of usability and behavior. So we can find out. I think this speaks back to Councillor Dayu's question about width and length and angle, just to make sure that it wouldn't become so steep that it would be impossible to use. But I don't think we have the same kinds of water drops as we do in a place like the Hawks. Anything else on option 3 that needs to be clarified? Councillor Dayu.
I suppose I did jump the gun in offering my comments previously on, on the wood stove, etc. Those were mainly for option 3, not for option 2. But I'm sure you picked up on that. The only clarification that I would make at this stage is in that while folks on Hardwood do believe that such a structure could be made to work, it's not the #1 choice, but they believe it could be made to work so long as the second pier is not designed to the same specification as the first, and that immediacy of access can be continued with whatever happens to that second pier. So whether it's left the way it is, whether it's rebuilt exactly the way it is, whether it's rebuilt with ready rock, but to the same height, that they're basically, when you come in with your wood stove, you're going to want that option of taking it down the full ramp or doing the lateral moves that are currently still possible with the second pier. And I would think I would think that's a pretty firm line. It certainly is for me, that we do not replicate the second pier to the same dimensions as the first to enable that adaptability.
Councillor Dayu, has there been any, just circling back to what Lisa said, have you had any discussion with your folks about just having the one pier and redesigning or re-landscaping the other side? So there would be similar to the photograph provided by the engineering firm, that there would be the one pier and quite an extensive dock. Instead of the 2 arms, there would be one, and it would just be extended further into the lake.
No, we've not had that conversation. I think, I can't speak for them. I certainly know that on high volume weekends, long weekends, etc., there are a lot of boats using those piers, at the same time. I can't speak beyond that to volume. I think a main concern would be when it comes to construction materials, wood stoves, those sorts of things, that they do have that flexibility. I imagine that's what they would say, that they would prefer a 2-pier system, but I've not had that conversation, no.
Yeah, and I feel it's really important to say, and I will be labeled the big bad meanie for saying this, is like, everybody doesn't get exactly what they want. So our job in replacing this infrastructure for usability, accessibility, and longevity is to find common ground. And I think, as I often say, that everybody has to concede something for the greater good. And I'm back to, we can't This is a $180,000 project, and I really struggle, willing to get the questions answered, but really struggle with spending more money to provide something because folks are used to it. We're all in the world and in life, we're all used to things, and things change. And I'm not saying that we're going to, cast off the concerns and the safety of our taxpayers by doing what we want. But I do think it's very important to have regard for what these costs could be, and if those costs are a wise choice facing in the face of other projects. The asset management plan I think is going to set us spinning. So I will reiterate that again sometime in this conversation. So option 3 then. Any further thoughts on option 3? And I'm not even sure what option 4 is. Add a dock on the side. I struggle with that because we're back to that whole, what's the purpose of these structures? How are people using them? Has that been the appropriate use, even if it's been the traditional use? What we don't yet have which we're going to have, I promise very soon, a greater philosophical discussion on our approach to docks and landings prior to receiving the asset management plan, because we have historically, this is an amalgamated community. In the north, there are landings. In the south, there are only boat launches. So we could in the future spend a tremendous amount of money for one set of folks that the other set of folks who also pay taxes don't have access to. So part of the greater conversation about docks and landings will hopefully come very soon, so that we can discuss the overall parameters and the guidelines within which we will make these kinds of decisions for our community going forward. Because I'm not convinced that the current approach is sustainable for the future in the face of competing projects and budget limitations. So that's my speech on that part. I'm not sure if I saw a hand or I see a hand. Deputy Mayor Danielson.
Just to one comment that Councillor Dayu made about leaving the existing pier, the remaining pier as it is. I don't believe that we can do that. We're replacing them for a reason, and that's because they're reaching a point where there's so much maintenance, and they're not, they're going to be unstable at some point in time. I think we have to do something. We can't just leave what's there. So to find a viable solution is, at the the most practical solution is how we have to go forward.
Mm-hmm. Councillor Dayu.
Yeah, I certainly agree with Deputy Mayor Danielson. I wasn't suggesting that as a recommendation. I believe it was the first in a series of options before us, including just leaving it as it is. More likely, in my mind, would be just rebuilding what is there in order to save on those costs and make sure the design does work the way it has for many years. I'm certainly not proposing that we leave it there.
Thank you, Lisa Berry.
Hi, I think I was the one that brought up that, and that's not what I was meaning. I wasn't meaning leave it as it is. I was meaning extending the ramp, and that would still give a pier, a dock, and a ramp. So you would sort of clean up the existing area. In fact, you might have two docks. You might have to have two docks.
Well, that's the proposal under option 3 is to have docks for ingress and egress.
I keep agreeing with the mayor in that. I keep thinking of it as a parent, and we have a lot of kids that need to have shoes, but we can't afford the best shoes for the amount of kids that we have. So we need to have, good working shoes on every child, but I don't know if we need to have two piers and dock systems at one landing, when down here we don't have docks at all.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be an important piece for us to lay the groundwork for docks and landings going forward. We know over the last many years we've we've been faced with more infrastructure projects than there is money to undertake. And so we've always done a really good job of stocking away reserves and picking away at them when we can. And I think that when we get the asset management plan, we'll be in for a surprise in terms of right across the township, the costs that are going to be associated with maintaining all of our infrastructure, not just docks and landings. That's why I'd like to have like a sort of a good old chin wag about the philosophy of docks and landings, talk about all of this so that when we do get the asset management plan, we'll have already laid our own groundwork for our thinking, because we actually haven't done that about docks and landings, and I feel they're creeping up on us in terms of infrastructure and costs, and I'd like us to be a little more prepared for what's ahead. So we'll see that, and Lisa, that will be part of that bigger project or that bigger discussion. Is there any interest in option 4? I was kind of hoping that we might land on 2 to investigate, as opposed to asking for further questions on all of them. My concern with adding a dock along the side of the pier is it's just another step, and it would have to float, and then you'd be on the pier, and then you'd have to step down to the dock and then into your boat. And I don't see that as being a solution at all. It just creates more steps and more problems. But looking for thoughts from council on that particular option.
It wouldn't have to be floating.
Councillor Dayu?
Yeah, it is the least preferred option on the lake. There were also some safety and security current concerns that were raised with that option with regards to what the average human in Ontario is used to with respect to a step down. So if you look at the building code of Ontario, there is a certain limitation of how big a step can be. And in order to bring a step down to this situation that would be more in keeping with where the boat level is, this step down would be actually quite a bit greater than what we're used to as Ontarians, and that could cause some real safety concerns. People might just misstep, and there could be more tumbles. So certainly from the Lakers' perspective, and certainly from my perspective, that would be the third of the 3 options to consider. I would be very happy just looking into the costs of options 2 and 3 myself.
I have to agree with you on option 4, and that's called the rise and run, by the way. And you're right, and you know when someone doesn't have the rise correctly, and you just walk down a set of stairs, you get that little bump at the bottom. And that's what I said at the beginning, is I see number 4 as being tremendously problematic for a boatload of reasons, no pun intended. Would council be amenable to removing option 4 and option 1? And landing on some further investigation on 2 and 3. I'm seeing nods. Okay, well.
One point, if I may.
Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
I think that at some point there was a comment about, okay, once we decide how we're going to proceed, what option we're going to go with, assuming that we're going to be buying floating docks for the end of each pier. I think Chris had suggested the possibility of deferring the acquisition of them until next year. And even though it is rather late in the season, I think we should go ahead and buy them now, given the price of lumber. And how,
well, we haven't made that decision.
but I'm just saying, if we decided that we're going to buy floating docks, we should get them this year, even if it means just putting them in storage. I just see them being just that much more money next year, and deferring part of the cost to next year. I just like us to be done with it once and for all, no matter what direction we take.
Mm-hmm. Well, being in the middle of a construction project myself, I can attest to the cost of lumber and the foot race to get to the lumber store when a delivery arrives. It's their lumber is scarce and expensive at the moment. So you're not wrong there. So is there anything else we want to talk about? We've got a number of questions. There's a bigger conversation to have about use and dare I say service levels. you know, the limitations on what can and can't use our various accesses. We need to talk about docking versus loading and unloading, mooring. But all of those things I'd like to set aside for the big philosophical discussion so that we can really get ourselves ready for the upcoming budget year, as well as the receipt of our asset management plan. So with that having been said, anything else that you want to talk about? There's quite a bit for staff to go back and get some more answers on. And so obviously we're going to defer a decision on the next steps on the project itself, pending the receipt of all this information. I see Liz first and then Jen.
I was just going to say, I know there's quite a bit of information that we're looking for. I'm just hoping that we can either tack it on to one of our existing special meetings like next Monday, or that I just am seeking as rapid a solution or decision as we can possibly make on this to reduce the angst. I also see that the longer we go with it, the more costs are going to be associated with it. But just, you know, we need to resolve this as soon as we can.
Yeah, I don't disagree. And we do have, you know, our meeting today was scheduled some time ago for our zoning bylaw review, and it's almost lunchtime and we haven't gotten to the main purpose of today's meeting. We have a meeting next week, and we can certainly schedule a meeting in the middle if we need to. I agree that there's some speedy resolution is probably best. Councillor Dayu?
It sounds like we've landed on exploring options 2 and 3 further, and I think that's great. Could we also explore all of the possibilities for the second pier at this time so that we can actually look at that cost balance? I think that would save us some time, and it may actually open up the scope for options that right now feel a bit prohibitive.
You're going to have to keep talking. I'm not following. We have asked for some clarification on issues related to the second pier. What else were you referring to?
Well, I guess perhaps just clarity on what specifically we have asked for with regards to those issues. For example, can we agree at this stage to ask for a costing on a replacement of what is currently there, so that we can weigh that against the Ready Rock option that we already have in mind? And are we also going to be asking the engineer for the specific cost of changing the design of the second pier to only be two layers, so that it's not just an estimate, but a known entity for our balance books, etc.
Maybe I'm not paying attention. Are you looking for costs on replacing a filled timber crib?
I am looking to go back to the April 4th, 2019 report that Mr. Card submitted to us, where he requested our consideration of the new material. You know, the other option was ? Can we revisit that option for the second dock so that we can weigh up the actual costs of making that change instead of proceeding full force with the Ready Rock? Because there could be some considerable cost savings there if we are able to surplus the materials for the second pier that we've already purchased.
Councillor Barry, you're on mute.
At this point, I would feel comfortable finding out what the cost would be to re-engineer the new dock that's going to be built and get that cost. And then also finding out the cost of changing the existing dock that's been built. Because I think we know the prices of the additional.
About piers, not docks.
Sorry, piers. Right? Yes.
So I think some of that has been covered in the questions that have been asked already, Lisa. So I can tell you that I will not support the dismantling of the first dock.
I don't support it, but I would like to. I don't support it, but I'd like to see the cost of it.
Then why would you incur costs to find out the costs of something that you don't support? That doesn't make sense.
I guess I would be interested to see if they could do it from an engineering standpoint.
Oh, with enough money in gravel, an engineer can do anything. Yeah, I mean, I think, again, we need to be careful that we're not, that it's not a custom order. This is all going to take time. It's going to cost money on an already really expensive project. I think we've already landed at some further questions about options 2 and 3, and we'll take it from there. I think that's the best course of action, given the conversation that we've just had. Liz?
And we've already asked the question about how is it that we can go about removing a layer? Like, what are the implications of that? So in essence, we've kind of will be looking at that concern that you've got. And you got to keep in mind that every time you ask for something to, let's look at this, or let's think about that, or let's redesign, you're adding engineering costs, cha-ching in a rapid way, and you're making change orders to a contract that's in place, and our contractor, not our engineer, can look to us for loss of revenue, losses associated with changes to the contract, all those, there's all kinds of implications to
Potential, there's potential implications.
Yeah.
Because we don't know for sure what that might look like. Okay, so we've landed at some really good questions regards options 2 and 3, and we're going to have a roll up your sleeves for a broad-based philosophical discussion about docks and landings as a whole in the near future. And Councillor Barry.
Will there be a pricing for just having the additional docks and just a boat launch and the existing pier?
So you mean not building the second pier, but having an extended dock on the existing pier?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Madam CAO, I assume you're taking notes there somewhere. Did we talk about that?
we did.
It was suggested, but council didn't make a decision on it. From what I heard council say, and I think the deputy mayor may have said it, is that doesn't seem to be an option. It's becoming a health and safety issue, and we do need to rebuild it. That's what I understood.
Well, I think what Councillor Barry's asking is the possibility of just eliminating the second pier completely and extending the docks on the existing one. But that doesn't address the concerns for the height of the first one. So I don't know that itself is a solution. So let's get the questions answered that council has asked on the options presented. And Liz, did you have something else you wanted to say, or were you answering?
No, I think I'm okay. I was just wondering about the kind of maybe having, I'm hoping that we'll have enough information and all our questions will be asked when we meet again. I'm just wondering about the possibility or the appropriateness of maybe asking the engineer to stand on by when we have our next meeting, so that if there are any unanswered engineering or technical questions that Chris might be unable to answer, that we can, I just want us to be able to make a decision when we meet again. So it might be beneficial if we have more technical questions and the engineer can give us a ready response, that might be a suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if council feels better asking the technical questions directly to the engineer, because of course none of us are engineers, I think that can probably be arranged. We just need to keep in mind that, we may ask questions that to an engineer seem a bit silly, but we don't know because we're not engineers. So all of the more information, the better for moving forward. So that can be a question that can be asked as well of the engineer. All right, is there anything else on this today? I mean, it's a good conversation, and I'm pleased that we've heard what folks had to say, and particularly I think made it very sort of obvious where I stand on I'm willing to, more than willing to have a look to make sure that safety and the most usability is provided. But certainly we need to draw a line somewhere. So we will ask the questions. We'll have those questions answered hopefully sooner than later, and maybe we'll see. I'll talk to the CAO and the clerk and see if we can attach this to our. We do have the zoning bylaw discussion on the 31st next Monday about short-term rentals, and similarly to today, we could, if we have the information we need, tack that onto that meeting. So stand by on that, because that's a very real possibility. But we'll wait and see. Okay, final call. Anything else on this issue today? Thank you, everybody, for all the attention that's been paid to this, and we'll carry on. So I think that would be a receive for information and deferral, Madam Clerk.
Bring back further
Bring back
information
further
on options
information.
2 and 3.
May I have a mover and a seconder for that? Councillor Barry, Deputy Mayor Danielson.
Moved by Councillor Barry, second by Deputy Mayor Danielson. Be it resolved that Council acknowledge receipt of report PRT 920 regarding Hardwood Clinto Lake Landing project update submitted by Chris Card dated August 24th, 2020. And further, the Council hereby directs staff to bring back further information on options 2 and 3 to Council for further consideration.
All in favor? That is carried. Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Chris. Appreciate. I know this issue has consumed your life for the past couple of weeks, so certainly appreciate the attention you've paid to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.
You do. Lunchtime.
Is there any food in the fridge here at the township office?
I'm going to get Carol a pizza.
You guys are all at home and I'm not. So I think it's probably in our best interest to take a lunch break. Is everybody okay with that? A little bit of a refresher. So, so this is awkward because people are watching us have this conversation. I have no food and I'm not near home. Yeah, 1 o'clock. If we take an hour, I could nip home and get a nibble. Would that be okay for council? Because I'm fading away in front of your eyes.
Well,
okay.
We have some fulsome discussion to come still. So, I think whatever, an hour is not unreasonable. I know that might be not the best solution for those that are watching, but everybody's got to have lunch.
Well, again, meetings are for us, not for others. So, okay, so we'll reconvene at it's dead on noon, so we'll reconvene at 1 and carry on with the zoning bylaw portion of today's program. Councillor Barry.
Was there any consideration on deferring the conversation until our contracted planner can be with us?
I think we need to do that.
I don't. Sean can take us through.
Okay.
We're good for that. Okay, so we'll take a break for lunch, and we'll see your smiling faces back on the screen for 1 o'clock. Okay, welcome back to the Algonquin Highlands Council meeting for August 24th. Our apologies for the delay. There was some technical difficulties. We seem to have sorted them out and we're all Smiling face is back on the screen. Our next item of business is the zoning bylaw review, and we will bring in planner Sean O'Callahan to take us through that report.
Good afternoon.
Hello, Sean. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Great, thanks. You are pinch hitting for Mr. Corbett today. He has had some challenges and is unable to join us. So apologies for the last minute up to bat, but here you go. So you're going to take us through the zoning bylaw review. Council did ask to have a number of things separated out to allow for a bit more of a fulsome discussion, and there are, I think, 5 or 6 of them. So I don't know if you want to go through the report as a whole and then we'll circle back to each item, or we could address each item as they're as you tell us about them.
Whichever works for council, I'm happy to follow that way, but I can start. So yes, this report is to provide council with background information on a few specific items as part of the Township zoning bylaw review. The first item on that list is backyard chickens. The raising of chickens is currently identified in the Township zoning bylaw as being a farm activity. Thus, it's limited to zones in which a farm is a permitted use, and that is restricted to the rural zone of the Township zoning bylaw. In determining whether to permit backyard chickens, the Ministry of Agriculture, Food, and Rural Affairs does identify issues that municipalities should be aware of. And those include animal health and public health, animal care, predators, and food safety. Some other issues that have been identified include noise, odor, appearance, and property values. Alternatively, there have been some benefits with backyard chickens identified by Harvest Halliburton, and these would include improving community food security, environmental benefits, health benefits, and social well-being. Greg's report also lists what other surrounding municipalities are doing with backyard chickens and which ones consider them in their zoning bylaw for council's consideration there. Should council wish to permit the keeping of backyard chickens in zones other than the rural zone, appropriate rules and regulations would need to be established in the zoning bylaw in order to govern that use. The following provides a general overview of some of the regulations that should be considered, and that would include establishing of a definition for a backyard chicken, require a minimum lot area and lot frontage, require a minimum setback from a water body and potable water supplies, establishing a maximum number of chickens permitted, prohibition on roosters, establish minimum coop dimensions, outdoor space requirements, setbacks from property lines, the requirement for fencing, and to prohibit any slaughtering on site. In addition to zoning regulations, some municipalities also have included a licensing or regulatory bylaws under the Municipal Act. This provides a municipality with greater authority to regulate actual operations of the activity should they wish to.
I think just going through this first one, we can approach them just piece by piece.
Sure.
Okay, I'm just going to go straight to council for thoughts on backyard chickens. So who wants to tackle that one? Councillor Dayu, I know you do. And I know you're a yes.
Am I first then? Shall I go?
Yes.
My primary question to you, Sean, actually rolls the chickens in a little bit with the cannabis. It has to do with the definition of farm. When I look at the definition that is provided in the report, oh, hold on a second, I've got to get that screen back up. It refers to a whole number of things. Any farming or agricultural use, including apiaries, aviaries, berry or bush crops, greenhouses, vegetable farming, fruit produce on the land or in greenhouses. And the reason I'm asking about this is whether whether if the question of cannabis and poultry, and I know we're on poultry at the minute, but if it's more a question of how we define what a farm is, rather than looking at the specific issue itself. I mean, when I look at that definition of farm, it doesn't say for what purpose those things are held. And if the purpose of the farm for zoning is, you know, for the purpose of large scale distribution or for the purpose of gathering an income or whatever it might be, then yeah, absolutely. I probably want to see things like poultry, backyard chicken as being part of that farm. But I grow vegetables, I grow flowers, I have berry bushes that I harvest. There are at least 4 things on that list that I do in my backyard already. And I wonder if I am permitted to do those things in my backyard already, whether the backyard chickens may also find a way of being excluded from the farm category because of its small scale. That's a really convoluted way of getting to my point, and I'm sorry about that. But I wonder if that's sufficiently clear.
So you're right. The current definition of a farm is very broad. We could look at further refining that to try and break out the different scales of farming operation from a fully, like a large farm operation compared to somebody growing some vegetables in their backyard. I mean, under the current bylaw, it could be argued that someone growing vegetables and berries in their backyard could be defined as a farm. So that is something we can look at expanding upon or further refining.
Yeah, I almost wonder if that's if that's a reasonable entry point into this conversation, because there are other things as well that may keep cropping up. You know, it's backyard chickens. Soon we'll be getting into cannabis. I also have questions about beekeeping, and there is a big difference in the scale of beekeeping from, you know, having basically 1 box of bees for your own consumption and to support your very localized habitat, and creating a big silo full of honey that you're selling to all parts of the province. I don't know, Mayor Moffat, what do you want to do with that?
I think you make actually a good point. I think there is room to as Sean said, to break out some of the scales. It's funny when you said beekeeping, at first I thought that's a really great point. And then I thought, wait a minute, do you mean, I know we're not talking about beekeeping, but as an example, does breaking up or breaking out parts of the farming definition that currently exists in our bylaw allow for a tremendous amount of crazy making micromanagement? Because I would say, just back to the bees, it could be a box of bees and the neighbor 25 feet away could have an allergy. So are you talking about breaking it out to better clarify what is and isn't allowed? Or are you suggesting that there's a further conversation about backyard bees? Because I think that would be tremendously problematic.
I am thinking that in order to satisfactorily answer the question about backyard chickens and cannabis, which is coming up, and all the other things that might come up, like beekeeping, I wonder if looking again at the farming definition and clarifying purpose and scale would mean that there are certain activities which happen on properties all over Algonquin Highlands, which would automatically, fall into what is permissible, and therefore, then I don't have to go to the Committee of Adjustment in order to grow some carrots, because as per this definition, it sort of looks like I do, and therefore, beekeeping or poultry or cannabis would also. Yeah, I'm not sure how better to explain it. I just wonder if getting at the overall definition would help clarify the type of activity that we're talking about, which are all backyard activities instead of commercial activities.
And I think that's it. It's commercial versus home use. And Lisa Berry is anxious to weigh in here.
I think it's important that we look at what we're concerned about versus the philosophy of having them. I think if our concern is, waterways and chickens going out on roadways, then that's where we need to look at it. I was doing some research because I did sit on Harvest Halliburton for some time. And interestingly enough, the Lake of Bays, which is like sort of our neighboring community here, they passed a resolution in 2013, and they've allowed them in rural residential settings, community settings, which I guess would be our settlement areas. And basically they've referenced OMAFRA's in their guide. They have said that people that thou have chickens shall follow OMAFRA's good animal husbandry practices. So they've sort of taken it back to OMAFRA, and they've made it a minimum of 5 hens on anything under an acre and 10 hens anything over an acre, and that they have to be like fenced in areas.
And so we've gone in a couple of different directions here. I guess, so Jen, you're saying that in order to be able to make a decision on the 2 issues before us today, you're looking for more clarification around the farming definition. Lisa's approaching it from a different direction.
Yeah.
So I guess what I want to do is because this could end the conversation fairly quickly. Members of council who are on the screen, do you want to yes, no for hens? Notwithstanding, the details of how many and fencing and the list of items that has been provided, but generally as a philosophy, do you support hens on properties other than rural? Yes, no. And then I think from there we can take the conversation to somewhere else. Because if everyone says no, they don't support hens, then it's just a no, and the rest of it doesn't matter. I rather suspect that 2 of the faces on the screen are a hard yes for chickens, and I was right. And so, Liz and Julie, what are your thoughts just generally on chickens, backyard chickens? Julie.
Go ahead.
I support it for personal use only.
So
And I
that links us back to what Jen was saying about further refining the difference between commercialization and personal use. Is that going to become an enforcement problem? No, these chickens are just for me. I'm not selling anything from them. Like, how far could we get into this to create our own nightmare?
Oh.
I mean, anything can. Liz, what are your thoughts on the chooks in the yard?
I think that there is some room for I certainly agree that it's probably beneficial for us to look at the definition of farm and what's a farm, what isn't a farm. But I think that we can separate this particular discussion out, because to me, what's intended here is, are we going to allow chickens in the normal residential backyard? That's what's being brought to us for approval. And I don't have a problem, as long as we put some limitations in place. I don't agree with backyard chickens in all zones. I'm not too keen about the shoreline residential. But I think we can, go beyond just rural if there are some restrictions in place about the number of chickens and how they're kept. I think there's some room for discussion there.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have a problem with the idea of backyard hens at all, but that's what I would want to further discuss is what those restrictions, limitations, and opportunities are. Lisa, is your hand up again?
Yeah, I've heard the comment about where they are, like specifically shoreline. And my thoughts are, there's a difference between someone that has a shoreline property that's an acre and someone that has a shoreline property that's 100 acres. And, I think that we should be really focusing on why versus where at this point. Like what are our limitations?
Mm-hmm. And so then, so you want it to be based on land size. Do you think there would be a sliding scale that if you had 100 acres, you could have 100 hens, or is it still 4 hens?
I think a sliding scale. And again, maybe that goes into commercial versus self-sufficiency.
Yeah, and I think that's important. I think the work that you did on Harvest Halliburton and all the work that that the Environment Committee put in when we did the OP review, this was all sort of all connected in. And so we have made some changes that do provide for encouraging different land uses and a more sustainable approach to land use. So this falls well into that category. We would just need to refine the details. Jen?
I think there are some equity issues that would have to be considered. I like the idea of a sliding scale, but I'm hesitant when I think of some families in the township who are, fairly low income. They've got a tiny little plot. The chickens are just one way to get fresh eggs on the table that kind of helps them out a little bit. And if we say, well, you can only have 2 hens, but the guy next door who has a butler can have as many as he wants, then I don't know. I put it out there. I think equity is always a question that has to be remembered.
Yeah, that's true. Lisa?
One of the things that I read in some municipalities and some not, the prohibition of slaughtering. And first of all, I take offense to that word when really it isn't. In chicken language, it's not called slaughtering at a homestead. It's called processing, which is sort of goes back to being sustainable. And I think if you're practicing the rules and you have the skills to be self-sufficient, that prohibiting that sort of defeats some of the guiding principles.
Yeah. Yes. I don't think you're wrong, but we need to make sure, again, not too different from the conversation of this morning, is we have to try and find the best outcome for the most people. We can't custom design permissions for the number of creatures based on a family's various factors and lifestyles and needs. I'm going to go to Liz first.
I think the issue of slaughtering goes back to the size of property. And where you're located. If we're talking about, and we don't have traditional subdivisions like some communities have got, where you're right next door to your neighbor, and your children are looking through the fence at their neighbor, seeing chickens being slaughtered. I think that's what they were trying to stay away from. Whereas in a more rural setting, you're not likely to see that, or on a larger property. You can call it processing if you like, but a lot of people watching it would call it slaughtering.
Well, we're not going to debate semantics. It's the where and when is it appropriate or not to end the life of a chicken on what land. I'm going to go to Lisa and then back to Jen.
Just a question: have we had any regulations on how hunters slaughter or process their kill?
Sean, can you answer that question?
We have regulations on where a hunt can be located, but it does not go into the details of where that meat would be processed.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we're picking up speed on a slope that's kind of slippery. Jen.
I appreciate some people can get a bit queasy when an animal is being killed. It is where our food comes from. So I don't have a difficulty, making that visible myself. I think we are a bit removed from where our food comes from, and this is a pretty essential one. But my primary point, my primary point is on the slaughtering question. If we have prohibited roosters, or if that's a consideration to prohibit roosters, then any sort of processing of the chickens would inevitably be when the animal is ill and has to be put down, because there will not be new flocks of chickens coming through every year out of that backyard. It's the birds and the bees.
Yeah, that's true. And I'm going to say something that's completely contrary to your equity proposition is that we all know somebody who every spring posts their little box of chicks that they bought for that year's flock. So, but again, if the whole purpose is to give people a boost and you know, augment their table, then there may not be money to buy chicks. I haven't got any idea what chicks are worth every year. But you know, we have to be careful not to micromanage this within an inch of its life. I think what I heard so far is so roads. That's a good point, Lisa. Is but they're going to be cooped. So these aren't free range chickens, because I can just see the emails now. The chickens are in my yard again. Roads, waterfront. I think there are some water issues, and I heard some interest in commercial versus personal use, which in and of itself creates an enforcement question. No matter what we do, we have to realize that we only have two bylaw enforcement people, and we don't have any chicken wranglers. So you know, and no matter what we put in place on any matter. And even as Sean said, hunt camps are, you know, that we do have hunt camps, but that doesn't mean that you don't drive through a little area and see something hanging in someone's garage and a bunch of people standing around enjoying the fact that they've had a good hunt. And I'm not opposed to hunting or killing chickens, I'm just saying. So what I'm looking for then, I'm hearing generally that council, we're all pretty supportive of finding a way to allow backyard chickens. It's just a matter of further refining it. And I think part of that is a further refinement of the definition of farm, so we can separate out commercial versus you're just getting eggs for your table. You know, what happens, Jen, if someone has 4 hens and, you know, or 5 or whatever number we have, and then there's the little fridge at the end of the driveway that says, you know, put your $5 in and take your eggs. Well, that's commercial. Are we going to send David and Greg in to shut them down? Because how mean is that? No. So again, how far do you go into this before you're micromanaging every aspect of it? Lisa.
In relation to Jen's comment on the Butler property, the bylaw that's in Lake of Bays, they have a minimum of 5 under an acre and a maximum of 10 over an acre. So it isn't really that sliding.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm wondering about, and this is in relation to whether or not they should be allowed on shoreline properties. Sean, what is the actual definition of backyard? You know, if you look at the shoreline property from the road, the backyard is the waterfront. But some people might have their house turned around, face the other way, and the backyard is actually along the road, which is then visible. You know, to me, that there's a difference there.
We would just have to say the non-waterfront side.
Yeah, typically on a waterfront property, the water is considered the front yard.
The front yard. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So in terms of this particular issue, again, I've heard yes, we need to do some more work. Sean, have you heard enough that would allow you and Greg to go back and get some more detail or craft something, or do you need more things answered from your list?
No, I think this is sufficient enough for us to be able to begin drafting something to bring back to council for further comment. Really, we were looking essentially for whether or not council is in support of backyard chickens, and I'm hearing it seems like it's a yes.
I think generally, I think that if you guys can craft something, you know, we can pick at it a number of times to make sure we can peck at it a number of times. This is something that I think we need to take the time to get right, because it could go wrong pretty quickly. There's someone right now crafting an email that says, "Oh my God, you can't allow that." And so there's widespread support for this, but there's also opposition. So we want to make sure that we somehow thread that needle and make sure that as many best interests as possible are heard and represented. I'm going to go to Jen and then to Liz.
2 quick points. One that we haven't addressed very much yet, the question of predators. Bears and wolves, you know, they don't show up in Mississauga very often, but they sure as heck show up in Algonquin Highlands. And I think we just need to maybe flesh that out a tiny bit more, given where we are. I can certainly see some significant pushback in some areas where there is a high bear level, and they're already saying, no, we can't even compost in our backyard because of the bears. I can feel the waves coming. So just to bear that in mind would be one. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
I
no,
think-
I'm sorry.
Yes.
There was one other thing. And I apologize because I know this is out of sequence, but is now an okay moment to say, could we also consider bees? And would that be something that could come out of this conversation, the decision to go ahead and research beekeeping in a backyard a little bit more? Or would you like to see that introduced at another time?
I think that, and I mean, I'm just one person. I would rather see how that folds into a redefining of farm.
Okay.
And I have to say that people who have life and death situations related to stinging flying creatures, this is not a matter of, I just don't like the sound of hens clucking. This is life and death. And so I think we would need to be very, very careful in terms of where bees are allowed because of those possibilities. And we can't poll the township and say, well, no one lives there who, you know what I mean? So I think the bees are they're related, but a separate conversation because of the gravity of the potential outcome, the potential negative outcome. But we can absolutely talk about it. There's people who have bees where they're probably not supposed to have bees. Like you said, Jen, right now, I think you're probably in contravention of the bylaw, of the zoning bylaw. So am I. So there are a lot of people who already are, because I confess that I didn't realize all that stuff was in the definition of farm. So I do think that there is absolutely merit in having a further examination of exactly that. There's a difference between picking berries and growing carrots and having a riding stable or a pig farm. And yet they're all in the same definition. So if we're going to start allowing some different uses on smaller land, then we definitely need to have a look at that definition. So Sean, maybe that's something that you guys could do too, is maybe tease that apart and see what fits in sort of in the danger zone, the commercial zone, not zone as in zoning bylaw, but what's a commercial consideration, what's a personal use consideration, what's a danger situation in terms of any of these things. Liz.
I would just ask that the report also address the issue of permitting or licensing or not, and the issues associated with either of those.
And it's funny that you say that. I didn't even look at my own notes, but I've got that section circled and with the word yes and a question mark. And again, I know we're now into a permit and an enforcement issue.
Yeah.
But then, and again, locks only keep out honest people. I use that phrase all the time. If somebody doesn't have land that's zoned for any of these uses and they're doing it anyway, it's very hard to catch them unless somebody reports them. So no matter what we do, enforcement remains something that needs to stay top of mind. The other thing I wanted to mention is, because this situation did occur in Algonquin Highlands, somebody had chickens where they were not allowed to have chickens, and they made impassioned pleas that the chickens were actually pets and that they were allowed to keep them. So we also need to make sure that we're not going to play that game. So, because I don't know what you're supposed to do if someone says my chickens are my pets, but that was a difficult conversation to have. I don't know what the chickens are now. Okay, so this is our first look at this. So Sean, you have enough to move forward. Does anybody want to say anything else about chickens, particularly at the moment? Chickens. Okay. All right, so we'll see more on that. Minimum dwelling size. Sean, take it away for us, please.
Okay. Yes, so the zoning bylaw currently contains a minimum dwelling size for a single detached dwelling, and that is 74 square meters, which works out to approximately 797 square feet. And that is for all zones where a single detached dwelling is permitted. This has been in place for some time, with former bylaws of the amalgamated townships also containing minimum dwelling sizes, which generally ranged from 56 square meters to 75 square meters. It's not uncommon to prescribe a minimum dwelling size, with the primary purpose having been to protect the character of an area, to provide a minimum residential standard. Another factor influencing the establishment of a minimum dwelling size has been to ensure that a dwelling remains larger than an accessory sleeping cabin on the same property, both visually and functionally. Currently, the maximum size of a sleeping cabin is 45 square meters, which is approximately 485 square feet. Minimum dwelling size is also addressed through the Ontario Building Code. So, for example, if the township were to not have a minimum dwelling size and only rely on the Ontario Building Code, someone could technically build a dwelling as small as 188 square feet. Greg has also provided a list of surrounding municipalities and what their minimum dwelling size is. And as you can see on the list, we're one of the higher numbers on that list. There are some townships that permit a smaller dwelling than the 797 square feet. So if that's something that council wants to look at potentially reducing or leaving the same, that's kind of what we're looking for direction on at this point.
Yeah, I think, this fits into what will ultimately at some point be a bigger conversation about how Algonquin Highlands is going to accommodate some of the changes that have been made around housing and the housing challenges. There's garden suites and carriage houses and granny flats, as it were. A lot of those things are changing or have changed. We have a severe housing challenge in all of Haliburton County and beyond. We have a tremendously disproportionate number of seniors in our population. And so a smaller square foot house, to me, is something I'm certainly interested in talking about. But it can't, again, you don't want to have something so small that somebody has to have, I'm not talking about tiny houses, but you don't want to have somebody that has a house that's so small they have to have 7 sheds to store all their stuff in, because that's pointless. So thoughts from council on a reduction of minimum square footage to accommodate any or all of these needs in our community. Lisa Berry.
I support the smaller footprint for sure. I probably support a smaller footprint than everyone on council, but I guess my thought is there a possibility that if we come to an agreement, say we come in line with Dysart and Minden Hills and move to, say, just putting it out there, say 55 square meters, is it still possible that if someone wants to build something smaller, there is an avenue for them to do that? Because I think even if we make the square footage smaller, not everyone's going to be building a small house.
That's true. Sean, what do you say to that?
Yep, so somebody would have the option of applying for a minor variance to the Committee of Adjustment if they wanted to reduce what the minimum standard was.
And Sean, what would the criteria for approval in that, for a minor variance? Like, what would the Committee of Adjustment, why would the Committee of Adjustment say yes to that?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, in general terms, I guess someone could argue if they were on a small acreage, a small piece of property, and placing an 800 square foot dwelling on that property would present some challenges as far as meeting setbacks. Just off the top of my head, that's one argument I could think of. Yeah.
Okay, Lisa, back to you.
One of my thoughts are, personally, as an artist, if we did not have children, I would much prefer to have a smaller house and a bigger studio. So I'm thinking, like, that's a consideration I think that some people have is, if they do want to have, say, a greenhouse and a garage or a workshop, maybe their priorities aren't in the house as much as how they live on the property.
Yeah, and again, I mean, these are good philosophical discussions. We also want to be careful that we're not custom crafting for every possible opportunity. We need to, consider a bunch of them, but we can't. That's why committees of adjustment exist and the minor variance application process exists, so that if somebody wants permission to break the rules, it's carefully controlled, as opposed to the other way around. Councillor Dayoud.
Sean, what is implied by a minimum residential standard? How can I interpret that, please?
I believe what he's referring to there would be the minimum, the actual square footage, the size of the building.
Okay, when I read it in context, wait a minute. Just reading his report, it is not uncommon for municipalities to prescribe a minimum dwelling size with the primary purpose having been to protect the character of an area and to provide a minimum residential standard. So it sounds like it's just saying to prescribe a minimum dwelling size in order to have a minimum dwelling size. Is that how I would interpret it then?
I believe that's what the intent was there.
Okay, because I would argue that the character of the neighborhood in Algonquin Highlands is small cottages, small cabins. I think that is actually very much in keeping with who we have been for many, 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 many years, and it's changing now, but there are any number of beautiful small cabins dotted away on these hills and at these lakes that I think that smaller homes and smaller footprints is in keeping with that.
Interestingly enough, when I read that, we may need to get clarification on this, because my interpretation of that was it was to provide a minimum residential standard, meaning 4 walls, a roof, windows, bedrooms, bathrooms, kitchen, flush toilet, like the usual residential standard is how I interpreted it, but I could be wrong as well. So maybe we can just make a note that that's something that we would like clarification on. I mean, I know it's a little bit different, but at the airport we've had conversations about, as we've very slowly moved the business park idea forward. One of the things that we've all talked about is making sure that there are some standards in place so that we don't end up with, just shoddy looking buildings that we have no control over. So that was what I thought it was. So maybe we can get clarification on that. Councillor Shortreed.
John, by decreasing the square footage on a residence, does that increase the potential amount of outbuildings on a lot?
It would not. There's a set lot coverage for your principal building and your 5% of your lot area for accessory buildings.
So it doesn't matter what the size of the house is then?
No.
Okay.
And the other question that I don't think any of us have the answer to is the hard reality is that the money that we raise through taxation is our tax rates multiplied by the assessment that MPAC attaches to a property. And what's the connection between, do smaller houses mean smaller assessments mean less tax dollars, or is there any part of that equation that could be that could reflect our bottom line? Because we've even seen it just since March, since the pandemic, that there's a tremendous number of people here that haven't been here in the shoulder seasons, and more people are, property sales are through the roof, more people are deciding they can, if they can get high speed, can live and work here. And our community, I keep saying that our community is changing. And so that's going to have an impact on the amount of money we raise through taxation as our primary dollar generator to do the business it needs doing to keep up with the more people who are staying here. So that was a bit long-winded, I apologize. Do we have any idea, or does anybody know if smaller houses mean smaller assessment, which could mean less tax dollars for us to do the work we need to do to keep the township moving forward? And I don't know that. Angie, do you know about that?
Potentially it could, yes. It just depends on the value that MPAC assigns to a smaller home. So it could potentially, yes.
So if we get the clarification on what a minimum residential standard is, then maybe if it's, depending on what that definition, what that means, then it could be that there's an obligation to have an actual house, not a yurt or a tent or a trailer, which you can't have anyway, in order to keep property standards, which would reflect in the values. I don't know. Jen and then Lisa.
I'd also be curious to know if it's possible or advisable to differentiate between a cottage and a permanent residence, or a dwelling that could function as a permanent residence. So I sort of agree. It's one thing to think about folks living throughout the winter here and making sure that, yeah, they've got everything they need in Carol's definition of a minimum standard, yet to be clarified whether that's the actual definition. But winter long-term permanent residence is one. But if there is a family who's had a great plot of land for the last 100 years and all they can afford to build on it is, a 188 square foot building to sleep in with a porta potty, or with whatever the septic standard is that they have to meet, and a little kitchen, and that's it, because they can only come up for a week a year and they just don't want to lose that space. I just wonder if we're, if we should be treating these two different categories of use of the dwelling with different brushes.
See, to me, I would think that instead of, my concern is trying to categorize every person's opportunity. And that's where it would seem to me that we would make sure that our minor variance process was robust enough to allow for someone to apply for that for those reasons. Mind you, there's a fee attached to that, but yeah, that's food for thought. Lisa Berry.
I think it should be noted too that just because someone builds a small house doesn't mean they're going to end up with a small house. That's where people build additions and that type of thing.
That's true. Yeah, and the other thing too is just because someone builds a small house doesn't mean they can't afford to build anything larger. Maybe that's their choice. There are people that are reflecting on how they move through the world, and they want to make different choices with their space. So, but again, we can't accommodate everybody for every reason. Julie.
Have we had much interest in this?
I don't know.
So since I've been here, I've only dealt with one application through the Committee of Adjustment for a dwelling that was going to be less than the 74 square meter requirement.
So going forward, keeping it on the Committee of Adjustment wouldn't be a big drain on resources.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be that. It's not a popular application that we receive, no.
Okay, thank you.
Quite a bit when people are inquiring about properties, but there's not, I don't get the feeling that there's a push to reduce it, or people who are upset with that number.
So just to sort of wrap up, if I can, because obviously there's some questions. I'm hearing generalized support for consideration of a smaller footprint, but we've got a couple of clarifications that need to come back so that we can resolve the final outcome or not on this. Would that be an accurate assessment of the conversation so far?
Comment?
Pardon me, Liz?
I've had my hand up a number of times.
My apologies. You see, people keep moving around the screen, so I apologize if I haven't seen you. Go ahead.
Well, I do think that we need to look at, when we're talking about housing, that we need to look at the overall housing philosophy and what we are going to accept and not accept. When you talk about things like garden suites and secondary units, I think that kind of rolls into this discussion overall, or we'll need to have a separate discussion specific to housing in general. I apologize because I kind of chuckled when Jen talked about, what we are about, and that's, the small cottage, and it's too bad that we couldn't stay that way, because some of those traditional properties that have been there for years are lovely, and it's what makes us part of what we are. Unfortunately, the demographics are changing, and what people are building is not that. We're seeing small places being torn down and huge, homes being built called a cottage. So, we have to consider when you talk about a standard, what you're going to have next to each other, I do believe that the assessed value would change, on a smaller unit, but we'll get the answer to that. And I just wanted to say that I would support, something in around the 600 square foot as a maximum minimum.
Yeah, so I think we can land on those details when it circles back with more information. But all good points, and I appreciate that. Is there anything else on smaller footprint for now, or more questions that we want either information on or clarification about? So then we're into cannabis production, and we are again back to Jen's definition, but notwithstanding that, any working or breaking out of the definition of farm, this one's a bit interesting because it's of the definitions. So, a greenhouse is commercial, but cannabis is a farm, and it's legal, and it could be a business opportunity for someone. So, looking for thoughts from council on the cannabis production facilities. Jennifer.
I think just with poultry and so many other things, it's a question of scale and how you define what production at scale is. So if it's just for your own consumption plus a little bit for your neighbor, and then the guy down the road is missing some and he chucks you $5 for yeah, it happens, and it's going to happen. And I don't think we want to get caught up into the enforcement of that. So for me, the key is defining what does scale mean. Commercial and scale, but primarily scale.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if a government authorized producer wanted to set up shop, that's different than your 4 plants that are allowed at home, or your 8. Liz.
I think we need to land too on exactly how we're going to classify the zoning, depending on what the person wants to do. Because, if you had a big industrial building and you were processing, well, is that industrial or is it commercial? Or is it, if you've got the agreement to, say, grow 100 plants for resale to, for wholesale resale to someone who's going to have a retail business, is that agricultural? Is it commercial? So, I think that we really need to look at the different applications and different kinds of zoning. I know that one of the arguments that we've heard at the either Roma or AMO, I can't remember which, was that there are a number of different views on how the land is zoned, depending on what it's being used for. Some zone it industrial and some zone it agricultural, but I can also see the need for commercial.
So does the rest of council agree that there's some refinement around commercial, personal, industrial, and agricultural before we can land somewhere? And that would also then tie into the initial question about the definition of farming. I think those particularly tie together quite well. I'm kind of seeing nodding heads, so I'm seeing 1 nodding head, 2, 3 nodding head. So can we leave that with you, Sean, for you and Greg to do a little more digging into that, to just see what that might look like and how problematic it potentially could be for us? Again, enforcement, permits, licensing, we don't do a lot of that stuff, and other than building permits. And so where does this road take us if we are going to split out some of these definitions and decide what needs to be zoned what, or rezoned, as the case might be? How much work and effort and governance is involved in those 4 different definitions? That's kind of what I think I'm hearing around the table. Does that make sense? Jen, you're thinking about saying something?
I am, yeah. No, I agree. And my hope is that we would be able to land somewhere where what is produced for home consumption, maybe a little bit of neighborhood swapping, zucchinis for weed, whatever it might be, but that those definitions of what happens for home and neighborhood consumption are broad enough that we don't actually get a lot of enforcement problems, and we, people don't have to apply for this, that, or the other. That is sufficiently clear and broad. And then, the other categories are an entirely different matter. That's where we would want higher scrutiny. But to broaden the home-based stuff in spirit and in letter would be great.
Okay, so a little bit of work to be done there to make sure we can have a few more details to dig a little deeper into this, I think. Yes? Nod, nod,
Yes.
nod. Okay. Sean, is there anything else that you think you need for that, the cannabis production issue? Does this at all address, we did have a request some time ago for someone to make cannabis products in our rental kitchen. Would that be related to this, Sean?
I believe that would be more addressed through the township policy. I'm not sure if we limit what people can do in those kitchens.
Yeah, and you're right, Liz, that's part of it. And so maybe we can just put that bug in your ear too, Sean, that if we're going to go down the road of trying to bring our land use and opportunities in line with the legality or legalization of cannabis, that we need to make sure it touches all the bases in the township, which would include the policy around rentals, which couldn't come until we decided what we're doing with cannabis production. But while we're on the topic of cannabis, we may as well make sure we make a note not to forget those other things. Anything else on weed? Okay, then extensions to non-complying buildings and shoreline structures and setbacks. Talk to us about that, Sean, please.
Yes, so on this topic, concerns have been raised with the existing provisions that allows for substantial increases to development along the shoreline that do not meet the intent of the official plan, resulting in impacts to near shore environment and character of the lake. So Greg has prepared some options for consideration in addressing this matter, and those would include the following. One being limiting the expansion to a percentage of the gross floor area of the existing building. This would prevent small buildings from being replaced with much larger buildings, which impact the character and development on a lot. The drawback to this method, though, is that it would provide greater development rights to larger buildings as opposed to smaller ones. The second option would be to limit the expansion to a percentage of the gross floor area through a sliding scale based on the setback of the building from the shoreline, so that the further the building is set back from the shoreline, the greater increase would be permitted. This would provide incentive to property owners who are contemplating a reconstruction project to increase the setback of the building to the water. The third option would be limiting the width and height of a building based on a sliding scale, again, related to the setback of the building. The height and width of a building visually have the greatest impact when viewed from a water body. Thus, restricting width and height the closer the building is to a shoreline will assist in limiting that visual impact.
I thought that third one sounded incredibly complicated, but maybe I'm wrong. Liz, go ahead, please.
Well, I'm just wondering if there couldn't be some kind of consolidation. Like I kind of like the sound of number 2, but I'm wondering if there couldn't be. To me, I think the intent is that we're trying to save the. It's an environmental concern more than a visual concern. I know that people do get excited about what they see. That, oh my God, it's like a scar in my view, but I think our greater intent is an environmental one rather than a visual one. But you might want to work maybe the two together on that. I know that it does sound a bit complicated, but
yeah, and what I wanted to ask you, Sean, and this came up recently in a conversation with the county planner, is there a relationship between this discussion and what Charles had sent me about needing to for new lot creation and development, including septic system, tile bed must be set back a minimum of 30 meters from the high water mark of the lake with non-disturbance of the native soils and very limited removal of the shoreline. County official plan updated last year for the shoreline vegetation. This setback shall not be subject to a minor variance, which would lead to encroachment of development on the respective surface water features. Is that related to this at all? Because I think it's all about, as Liz has mentioned, about preservation of the shoreline and the front yard. And would it be, sometimes people do need to make amendments that are environmentally undesirable, but they are the lesser of two evils. So how does that portion of the county OP regarding the requirement for I guess it would be a zoning amendment as opposed to a minor variance, how does that relate to this conversation?
Yes. So if a redevelopment did not meet the, I guess, tests of a minor variance, they would have to apply for a zoning bylaw amendment. Redevelopment of a property can typically be dealt with through a minor variance application if they're looking to reduce the setback to a water body. If it was a vacant lot and they were looking at reducing the setback to a water body, that's where it would be more appropriate based on the county OP to go through a zoning bylaw amendment because it could be argued that that is not a minor application.
So it has to meet the test of minor. Okay, that's fair. I saw a hand, Lisa Berry, I think, and then Liz.
Sorry, just to be clear, is this sort of going again, is this going with like a grandfather clause? So you have a property, you've inherited an old cottage, you're tearing it down, but you want to keep it where you want to keep the new cottage where the old cottage was. Is that what this is explaining?
Yes, it's along those lines. That
Okay.
or constructing an addition to a building that was constructed closer than the bylaw requires today.
Okay. I didn't pick that up right now.
The problem is, Lisa, that so many of the applications that come into the Committee of Adjustment, they want to put a new building on the same basic footprint, but they want it to be a lot bigger. And
Right.
and 9 times out of 10, it ends up being closer to the water. It just it seems that way. And I'm hoping there's got to be a way to encourage people. It just seems to me that a lot of the applications that come to us, it's in a number of cases, this is what we want to do. It's really got nothing in relation to what we've got in place for rules and regulations, that they're not willing to look at going out sideways. It's always got to be, I mean, I know that people want to have a lovely lake view, but it just seems that nobody's willing to look at alternative solutions to increasing the size. And I don't know how that fits into your sliding scale or how we can deal with this, but I'd just like to somehow encourage people to try and meet our regulations or make regulations that will work a bit more for applicants and us.
I'm sort of smirking here because I agree with you. We've talked about this, you and I, Liz, a number of times. And the reason that I can't say nobody, but the reason folks continue to seek permission to break the rules is because we have a process in place that allows them to seek permission to break the rules. So it has to be the latter. It has to be whatever is that fine line between, and not even between, but among all the things that are happening. So, we've done the Love Your Lake program with CHA, and we've got a shoreline tree preservation bylaw that's been made a little more robust, and we are, I think sometime this fall, going to enter back into the arena of the shoreline preservation bylaw. There's blue-green algae blooms in, I think, 5 or 6 lakes in Muskoka now. We've had them in Algonquin Highlands. They've been in Haliburton County. Water quality, lake health, shoreline health are vital to the maintenance and sustainability of our community. Property values, enjoyment, lifestyles, economy, all of it. And so I think it is incumbent upon us to, even if it's unpopular, make some decisions that encourage more changes on properties that are sideways and back as opposed to closer. I mean, I think that's why that's here, because everybody collectively believes that. But I guess if each of us was faced with that decision, we would want it to go in our favor the other way, admittedly. Jen?
Yeah, for that very reason, I really like option number 2, which is to reward people who are interested in going back and to the side. Certainly in our home redevelopment, which is just ending now, our contractors worked hard with us to find a way to go back in a way that was really pleasing for our experience in the home, and it's turned out quite beautifully. There are ways of doing it. So indeed, it's a carrot and a stick. And I think option number 2 offers that quite nicely.
Liz, please.
One of the things that we quite often see coming to the Committee of Adjustment is that somebody designs a house and then they bring it to Sean and say, how are you going to make this work? Instead of looking at what we've got in place for requirements and designing the house accordingly. You know, that I don't know how many times we've heard, well, here's our design and that won't work. Well, you know, why didn't you find out what would work before you designed the house? It just seems like there's got to be a better way for us to approach this.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Sean, what do you say about everything you're hearing on this particular issue?
It sounds like there's interest in option 2, which, I mean, that's one I'm got my eye on. It does give that incentive to move a building back. I mean, it's still, people still have their existing development rights at the current location. So if they wanted to build the exact same size building as what's there right now, they could do that. You can't take away those existing development rights. But in most 9 times out of 10, they do want to build something larger. So this is the incentive to push it back. And there's still the option of a committee of adjustment if there's no opportunity to move back. If you have a rock cliff directly behind your cottage, there's a reason why you built where you built. But it would still need to be within the general planning policies we have in place at the township.
Mm-hmm. Lisa?
So going forward, how would that work if you moved back, you built under the new accordance? I guess you'd be meeting the setbacks. How would that work with new dwellings that are built on old footprints that now want to put a new deck on it? Do you know what I mean?
That creep.
The creeping.
Yes, so there is a separate section that deals with open decks being permitted to encroach within a required setback. So I'm not proposing that we change that. That's a pretty general permission within most zoning bylaws to allow certain parts of a building to encroach, such as an eave or an open deck.
Okay.
I think too, and Liz, I know that you'll agree with me, and Julie sitting on the committee of adjustment may as well. We've gnashed our teeth a number of times about what Lisa mentioned, what we lovingly call deck creep. And I don't know if this is related to this or not, but I'm going to say it anyway. The idea that you can build a deck, an open deck, and then you want a screened-in porch, and then the screened-in porch becomes, Sean, we've had this conversation. Then the screened-in porch becomes the Halliburton bedroom for the grandkids, and then we need a screened porch, so now you get to build an open deck and another screened porch. So, and that's that. And people don't build screened porches, except their parents, on the back of the house. You build them on the front. And so how do we prevent the continued deck and screened porch creep that just keeps moving forward and forward and forward?
So each application has to be, evaluated on their own merits. If an application for that situation were to come forward, the committee would be made aware of any previous minor variance applications that were part of that property. I think it would be hard for me to support someone to construct a screened-in porch on a deck they just recently constructed versus a deck that's been there for a long period of time. Yeah, that would be a hard one to, I'm not sure how you could specifically address that in a zoning bylaw. I mean, we are with this proposed section, but it doesn't prohibit someone from applying for a minor variance in that situation. It's a matter of bringing all the facts forward so the committee can make a good decision.
Liz?
I still think somehow we've got to address this. I know you said, Sean, that it's difficult to tell somebody that they can't just build a deck. But it seems because the deck is already there and they want to build the porch, well, I mean, the deck's already constructed and really what's the big deal? It's just a screened-in porch, which, in planning terms is not considered to be a room. But it is a room, I mean, it really is probably one of the best used rooms that a cottage has got. I mean, then all of a sudden it becomes a permanent room. It really does become a permanent room. And it's that slope that you slide right down from the minute you build a deck. Not to say that people don't want to, or would just simply want a deck and nothing more. But I find that the committee has a problem saying no when there's already a structure there, even though it's not really considered a development.
I don't know, Sean, I see your hand, Jen. I don't know, Sean, if you want to respond to that. Is there any room, is it in the Planning Act that a screen porch is not habitable space, or is that our language?
That's our language, but a setback does still apply to a screened-in room versus a open deck.
Right. Jen?
I wouldn't, at first blush, have a difficulty with turning a deck into a screened-in porch because, as far as I'm aware, there's no further environmental jeopardy that is placed on the surrounding area. Would that be true? In which case, why not let them do that? But then if they then went back and said, oh, now we need a deck, well, that's when it comes to the Committee of Adjustment to say, but we've already given you a deck and this is what you chose to do with it. And now we're getting beyond the sliding scale, perhaps, of what we can permit given the original footprint that you applied against. But to go from a deck to a screened-in, from an environmental perspective, I don't really see the impact.
Yeah, and Sean can speak to this because it's his world. I agree with you. The concern is, and for the short time in an interim I spent on the Committee of Adjustment, I spent more time pulling out my hair. There's a million examples. Somebody bought a property and somebody had a deck and they put a screened-in porch and then it became a glass sunroom. And then the property sold and the new people bought it and said exactly what you just said. Well, this needs a deck. And they applied for a deck and they got a deck. So I was the grumpy old lady. I said, well, they should be, there was no permit to turn that deck into a glass sunroom, whether it was, I don't know if I can't remember if one's needed or not. And that's what we call the deck creep. So I agree with you that there's nothing wrong with deciding that your porch needs a screened room on it. It's when the screened room becomes a 3-season and then it's a 4-season and then it's the grandkids' bedroom, and then we need a deck and then we need a screen porch on the deck, and it just keeps going and going and going and going. And that's what we've seen and seems to be the concern for a lot of people. So I don't know, Sean, if you want to speak to that. Is anything? Can you put on the roll file that, as Jen said, you've had your deck and you've had your screen porch and that's it? Or is that just a horrible thing to do?
No, so records of minor variance applications are attached to roll files, so that would be something that would be brought forward to the committee. Again, each application's evaluated on their own merits. Perhaps in that case, there was no other potential location, or that was the best location from an environmental standpoint. I forget the specifics, but if a deck's been there for 20 years and somebody applies to construct a screened-in porch on there and there's no real other available building sites, you're constructing no new hard surfaces. So that's one reason for supporting it. Again, it's hard to get into specifics. it really comes down to bringing any previous minor variance approvals forward to the committee so they realize they're not in a situation where somebody is just applying every year to build a deck and then a screened-in porch and then a deck. I mean, that information would need to be presented to the committee.
Right, Jen?
Impact my recommendation.
Sean, would that kind of information be available to real estate agents when they're kind of collecting information on a property so that people would know that, oh, careful, these folks have already, you know, they've hit their limit on what is permitted here?
Yeah, as part of our building compliance reports that most real estate agents or lawyers would request during a real estate transaction, certain files such as consents, severances, and minor variances would be identified.
Okay.
We kind of wandered off there into the long grass. If I bring us back to what's actually on the agenda, I think, Sean, you're hearing generalized support for option number 2, and maybe that could be worked. Liz had suggested that maybe build the viewscape into it somehow. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, if that's doable or problematic.
I can work with Greg on that. I'm sure there's a way of combining the two to some degree, but yeah, we'll explore what options are available there.
And you'll keep thinking about, I just actually called up my, I think I said to you the other day, Sean, oh, I've made additional notes for the zoning bylaw. And one of them is, you know, is there any way for screened porches to become habitable rooms, or is, you know, does that matter? I wrote stop porch creep. There also well, again, the applications for additions that turn relatively decent places that Jen has referred to nostalgically into monoliths, and I don't know if we want to be the people that put in a maximum building size. I do know that a couple of years ago there was something built on a lake in Algonquin Highlands, and there was a rallying cry for a maximum square footage, but I don't know that that's something we want to get into. Anybody, Sean, what are your thoughts on something like that?
It's a fair question. I mean, we do in some degree have a maximum square footage in the lot coverage that's permitted on a property, but it's a fairly generous lot coverage that's permitted. So if council wishes, we could look at potentially reducing that number, or looking at another sliding scale. If you're building within certain distance of the water, you're allowed this much coverage, versus if you're more than 30 meters back from the water, you're allowed this much coverage.
Thoughts from council on that, or are we getting too far into micro land use? Liz?
I'm a little reluctant about that. I think that we've got controls with the, you know, the maximum square footage or maximum percent coverage that you can have on a property for your primary dwelling and for your accessory buildings should do it. Interestingly enough, at the last committee of adjustment, we looked at a property. It was a reasonable sized property. It had a tremendous house on it, a huge house, but it fit. And, you know, I couldn't see any reason why you would want to say to them, build something less.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. I mean, I think we want to make incremental changes that work toward increased preservation of land and water and shorelines, and I think this is a good start. The other thing we need to consider, which we've seen in a lot, 2013, 15, and 17, when there's either been declarations of emergency by Minden for flooding, we see that because the Minden water, the water that is prevented from washing Minden off the map, it gets backed up into Algonquin Highlands. And so water levels related to changing weather patterns and climate issues is also a consideration for how, I think should be for a consideration for how close people are allowed to build to the water, especially in regards to if you have the 1940s cottage that's hanging on the water and you want to build it, you should have to move it back, which this speaks to, because we don't want to end up being held responsible for having allowed a building to be built when the water comes. And we currently know, or ought to know, that the water does come. So I think that's a consideration on our part as well in the whole bigger picture. Jen.
I'm afraid I don't have a recommendation to go along with this observation, but I think the observation is good on its own merit. In Ward 3, and I'm sure in the other wards, there is a rich and tremendous variety of lake cultures. So a lake like Oxtongue Lake, there are a lot of folk building permanent homes up here, and they want them to be a bit bigger because they want their grandkids to come up and to enjoy. And everywhere you look, almost everywhere you look around the lake, you are seeing these sorts of developments either already there or in place and upcoming. And then you have other lakes, which are Wolf Lake and Crown Lake and Hardwood Lake to a degree, and a number of others, which are these little jewels of lakes that haven't changed literally since the 1960s. And the folks who are on those lakes largely don't want any change ever to happen ever again. Obviously, I can't turn that into a universal statement, but certainly from the folks that I've met on those lakes, that is the prize of having a place on that lake, is because it does feel like you're stepping into a timeless space. And so it's hard to know how to support a community where you've got certain lake communities that really want to develop and grow and become permanent, and who are permanent and are supporting the economy. They're bringing businesses, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have these other beautiful little examples of time stood still. And to find a bylaw that covers the needs and interests of that spectrum is really challenging. And that's just in Ward 3.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I know a number of years ago I was asked to provide some comments, I think it was to the Coagama Lake Association, and I think it was the year after 2 years ago. And the question, what's the biggest challenge? And I noted in my response to them that exactly what you're saying, our biggest challenge, in my opinion, at that time was change management. That there are so many people that want to forever live on Golden Pond. I mean, that's what I grew up in as a cottager here. And yet there's still people who are clamoring for year-round jobs and a year-round economy and just more, bigger, better, faster, stronger. Where's our high speed? I would like to live at the cottage. And so it's a huge balance for us to have regard for how we became what we are, how we try to continue to be what we are while still growing and developing. And it's not an easy decision, and we have to kind of guesstimate where we're going with those things by having these conversations about who we want to be, and so who do we want to be, and then what are we going to put in place to manage that so that we can, again, give everybody a little bit of something that feeds their soul. And that's the tough part of our job. Absolutely. So unless there's anything else on what we've talked about so far for Sean, I think he's got lots of fodder to go away with to refine more for further conversation. We do have, as mentioned this morning, we have another meeting next week to have our second go around at short-term rentals. Actually, it's kind of our first go around with the public input, with a number of submissions on that. So picking away at the zoning bylaw, and part of that conversation eventually will have to be with the government. The province did just the other day open up a greater number of people for rental facilities and halls. And so we were talking a little bit earlier about that. What does that mean for municipalities? Does that mean that we could have a zoning bylaw public meeting? If not, how are we going to do that? I know there's been an extension, but this is a legislated and formalized process. So we have not yet figured out how we're going to, other than asking for written submissions for short-term rentals, there's the whole public process around, the draft, the finalized draft version of the bylaw following these individual conversations. So I'm sure Sean will be hearing from you about what you think that's going to look like.
Yes, certainly. We'll be rolling out a proposal on how to move forward with this. I mean, in the climate we're in right now, it's, yeah, holding a public meeting in a virtual format is an option. Whether or not that's the best option to proceed, that's something we'll have to bring forward and discuss further. But we are working, like with the conversations we're having today, we are working towards refining that document to bring forward to council.
And Sean, there are probably going to be a number of things in that that are really not up for discussion, that they're reflective of OP changes and other legislative changes that we're not going to be discussing. They just are what they are because someone else told us they had to be.
Precisely, yes.
Okay, so as creatures of the province, we don't have as much latitude as people may think we do. Is there anything else about today's zoning bylaw discussion that anybody wants to circle back on? Chickens? Anything? Okay, so we will, there's no resolution coming out of this, is there?
Just to receive Greg's report.
Just to receive Greg's report. So may I have a mover and a seconder to receive Greg's report? Lisa Berry and Jennifer Dayu, thank you.
Moved by Councillor Berry, second by Councillor Dayu, be it resolved that council acknowledge receipt of report PL 5720 regarding a zoning bylaw review submitted by Greg Corbett, consulting planner for the township and dated August 24th, 2020.
All in favor? That is carried. Yeah, sorry, I don't have an agenda. I do have an agenda in front of me. My apologies. I thought we were going to make it till noon today, so I'm all discombobulated. May I have a mover and a seconder for the confirmatory bylaw? Councillor Shortreed and Deputy Mayor Danielson.
Moved by Councillor Shortreed, second by Deputy Mayor Danielson, be it resolved that bylaw 2020-79, being a bylaw to confirm the proceedings of council held during its August 24th, 2020 special meeting, be received and read the first time, considered read a second and third time, and finally passed with the corporate seal affixed.
All in favor? That is carried. And adjournment. May I have a mover and a seconder to adjourn today's meeting? Councillors Dayu and Berry.
Moved by Councillor Dayu, second by Councillor Berry, be it resolved that council adjourns its August 24th, 2020 special meeting at 2:36 p.m.
All in favor of that? That is carried. Thanks, everybody. Great conversation. It's nice to break this out and really dig into some of these things that council identified and wanted to have a little more to talk about. So we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the day.